Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. And this morning, I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me as my guest Professor Dan Lieberman, who's the chair of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. Dan, welcome to the program.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
So, Dan, I'm super honored to have you. I understand you get asked by podcasts so often, and you've done a lot of them. So, I really appreciate you doing, at least agreeing to do one more.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm grumpy about podcasts sometimes.
It's no problem. Well, let me ask you, what made you decide to get into human evolutionary biology in the first place? Was it, what interests you about that topic?
It's kind of an accident. I mean, I think I always was interested in science and the past. And when I was a kid, I was absolutely sure I was going to become a geologist.
Huh.
I liked being outside, and I liked doing field work, and I loved the concept of deep time. And then when I got to college, I went to Harvard as an undergraduate. I signed up for some geology class they told me I had to take. It was mineralogy and crystallography, which turned out to be unbelievably boring. And at the same time, just for fun, they had this program called freshman seminars, and I don't know, there was a freshman seminar on human evolution, and I don't know, it looked kind of intriguing, and
Huh.
so I just kind of signed up and got in, and I loved it, and I got totally excited by it, and then took another class or two and just got hooked. And I think I fell in love with the theory of evolutionary, natural selection. The theory of evolution is such a powerful way of thinking. And I
Mhm.
also, um, realized just how important and interesting it is to study how and why humans are the way we are.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental question that we've been asking ever since, Darwin, or
Yeah.
before actually, but we've been asking scientifically ever since Darwin.
Is it the history aspect of it or the biology aspect of it that's kind of more interesting to you, or would you say?
Well, I think the reason I'm interested in it has changed over the years. So I think initially I just kind of wanted to know what happened in human evolution. And I also just love the fact that it's very multidisciplinary. I mean, in
Mm.
my field, you have to be a jack of all trades, right? We combine, some geology and anthropology and paleontology and
Mm.
physiology and whatever. And I love the fact that it involves field work as well as lab work. But as I've gotten older and longer in the tooth and grayer in my hair, I've become more really passionate about its relevance to the human condition, right?
Mm.
Because, we have a lot of challenges in the world today, serious problems that
Mm.
range from climate change to, you know, malnutrition and obesity and chronic disease, and the list is very long. And if we're going to address any of these questions, we have to understand why they occur in the first place, right? Otherwise, we're just treating the symptoms of problems rather than their causes. And if you want to understand the causes of something, especially in biology, you can't do it without evolution, because we weren't designed, we weren't engineered, we evolved. And if you want to understand why we are the way we are and how we got to be that way, and you need to have an evolutionary perspective. And so I've become very passionate about
Mm.
the value and utility of using evolutionary theory and data to think about human health and disease.
Mm. Well, tell me a little bit about how this research focus has evolved. Tell me kind of what you started doing and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Well, none of these paths are linear, right? So I initially wanted to do I was a kind of a who begat whom guy, right? I was a skull guy interested in the fossil record of human evolution. I had done some work in Kenya. I got to meet Richard Leakey and worked in the museum with, back in the day, and was interested in how you figure out, is this species different from that species, and how are they
Yeah.
related to each other? And um and that's really kind of how I got excited by it. But then I I started getting more interested in behavior and how like, what made these species actually different in the first place. Partly because I realized that nobody really cares about who begat whom. I mean, there's like 20 people who want to know if habilis was the descendant of Homo sediba versus Australopithecus africanus or whatever. I mean, it's pretty irrelevant to 99.9% of people's lives, right?
Right.
But why do we cooperate? Why do we share? So I got interested in sort of behavior. What were these these, because fossils are just rocks, right? What were these rocks doing when they were alive? So I started getting interested in behavior and development, and that got me interested in experimental biology. And so I had the good fortune of kind of falling in, meeting this wonderful paleontologist named A.W. Crompton, who everybody calls him Fuzz Crompton, really one of the great towering figures in vertebrate paleontology, who combined studying the fossil record of mammal evolution with experimental biomechanics.
Hmm.
And so I started studying, trying to use developmental and experimental approaches to understand why fossils are the way they are, and focused on the heads. And so I was a head guy, and I was working on things like brow ridges and chins and chewing and things like that. But I started working on a book on the evolution of the human head and got interested in head stabilization,
Hmm.
how we stabilize our funny little heads, because most animals have necks that stick out of the back of their heads, but we're like pogo sticks. We have tiny little necks that stick out the bottom of our heads, and that prevents us from stabilizing our heads the way others animals do.
Hmm.
And that led me to thinking about the evolution of running. And, then I started working on the evolution of running, and then that led to the thinking about physical activity and then how important physical activity is for health. And I just got really passionate about it and have been basically focusing on that ever since.
And now you're doing a lot of research on feet and shoes. Is that right? Isn't that kind of now you've
Yeah,
changed your focus on your body from the head to the feet? Is that kind of right?
that's right. Because, uh, so in 2004, my colleague and friend Dennis Bramble and I published this paper in Nature. It was the Born to Run paper, was on the cover of Nature, in which we made the argument that humans evolved to run long distances millions of years ago in order to hunt. And and this is again one of those stories, right? So that was 2004. In 2005, right before the Boston Marathon, I gave a big public lecture. It was a rainy, cold, wintry night. It's like a storm had been blowing into Boston. It was a nor'easter, and it was a huge audience, packed. Every seat was filled. It was very,
Hmm.
very flattering. And in the front row was this guy who had suspenders, and I could see him because he was in the front row, and he was wearing socks wrapped in duct tape, and he had a big bushy beard. And I thought maybe it's some homeless guy, from Harvard Square who'd wandered in out of the
Yeah.
rain.
Yeah.
But he was really paying attention to my lecture. And afterwards, he came up to me and he said, if we evolved to run, how can we wear shoes? Because obviously, I hate
Right.
to wear shoes. Why do I like to run barefoot? And I thought about it for a few seconds, and I said, well, obviously we've evolved to run barefoot, so maybe it's really normal. But I don't really know much about barefoot running. Why don't you come into the lab?
Huh.
Because he lived in the area. He actually introduced himself as a Harvard dropout by his own admissions from the Timothy Leary days. He had probably had a bit too much LSD, and he owns a bicycle shop here in town. And so he came into the lab like a week or two later. And I'll never forget, he came in, those Victorian bathing suits, those one-piece bathing suits with the
Yeah.
stripes. He came into the lab wearing one of these one of these bathing suits and ran in the lab. And at that point, we were looking at how your head jiggles when you run. When you hit the ground and you land on your heel, there's this shock wave which travels up your body and causes your head to jiggle.
Yeah.
And that's a problem for your eyes. You need to stabilize your eyes. So we were kind of interested in how you stabilize your eyes. And I remember there was a grad student in my lab who didn't land on his heel. He would forefoot strike, and his head didn't jiggle very much. And I was like really pissed off at him because he was like ruining our experiment and whatever. And then this fellow, Barefoot Jeffrey, came in and ran. We set up a kind of a little track and had cameras and a force plate and all that. And he ran like this graduate student, light as a feather, landed on the ball of his foot, and there was no impact peak, this collision that normally happens when people hit the ground, and his head didn't jiggle very much. And
Huh.
I asked him, I said, like, why do you land that way? He says, well, only idiots land on their heel. It hurts. And suddenly got interested in I suddenly thought, well, that makes sense. So we did a lot of research on the biomechanics and how it is that different ways of landing affect the mechanics of the physics of impact and how that affects your body. And before we knew it, we were studying barefoot running, and
Huh.
and that led to other research on the foot. And I'm lucky enough that I get to study whatever I want, and
Yeah. Right.
I've always loved foot anatomy when I taught anatomy because the foot is so cool. there's so much complexity in the foot. And I don't know, started studying foot biomechanics, and that led to a bunch of papers, including another cover article in Nature. And
Huh.
here I am. So it's just kind of, I went from the head to the foot.
So
It's,
before you wrote the article, so you didn't know about the barefoot running before you wrote the original article about Born to Run? I thought that the foot theory was the research that led you to conclude that we were born
no,
to
yeah,
run.
no, no, I was Born to Run paper in 2004 in Nature was really, I mean, we talked about arches and feet and whatever. We looked at all the
Yeah,
adaptations in the body that help us
yeah.
run long distances. But I wasn't really doing any research on feet. And I certainly
Hmm.
hadn't really thought very much about barefoot running until literally that, Barefoot Jeffrey came and, asked me that question
That's
after
so
my
fun. Did
lecture.
he
So,
get credit for some of that paperwork?
oh, I've thanked him many times and gotten to know him over the years. He's a delightful person.
Huh.
And really interested in science. And there's we started studying all these barefoot runners, and back then it was very, almost nobody knew about it, right?
Yeah, right.
There were these people, and it was a very small little kind of tightly knit community. They all called each other barefoot this, barefoot that, barefoot Ted, barefoot Jeff, barefoot. I can't remember all the barefoots, but
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and he was kind of one of this little small kind of community. They all knew each other online, and yeah, really lovely
Huh,
person.
huh, huh. Well, is the barefoot thing kind of controversial? I mean, what has been the reactions? Does everyone agree with this or does disagree? I mean, are
I
you down the
mean,
lightning rod? Tell me about that a little bit.
that's kind of one of the interesting things about science, which is that we were studying it from an evolutionary perspective, but obviously it has implications because um, if you land on the reason people are able to land on their heels is that they're wearing these modern cushioned running shoes that
Right.
that slow the rate at which your body hits decelerates when it hits the ground, and it makes it comfortable. And we argued that, and I stand by the evidence that for the most part, people who are barefoot, especially if they're running long distances on hard surfaces, they don't land on their heels, right?
Yeah.
So the modern running shoe has changed how people run, and we made the argument that it's maybe, if it's one of the reasons why some people get injured. And oh my God, it turned into such a controversy because
I can
the
imagine.
shoe companies got very upset. Then the shoe companies started making minimal shoes, and then and I don't believe that things are good or bad, right? But the way the media portrayed it was that I was this. I can't tell you how many times I've been called without my ever saying this a um, a barefoot running uh,
Evangelist.
evangelist or something like that. That somebody who believes that you should barefoot run, which I've never said.
Yeah.
And that I believe that shoes are bad for you, which I'll also never say. I'm wearing shoes right now. And we have this way of polarizing everything. We have Republicans and Democrats. We have,
Yeah, of course.
pro this, pro that, pro life, pro abortion, and it became like heel striking versus forefoot striking, which is ridiculous because actually, and we published a paper. Because I'm so upset by this, we published a paper showing that barefoot people do everything. Actually, they sometimes land on their heels, sometimes they land, but it became like this, pro versus anti thing. And then this fellow named Chris McDougall wrote a book which popularized a lot of my work, and which he titled the
Mm.
book, by the way, Born to Run. And it's full of, he got a lot of things wrong in that book, but that book really pushed a lot of buttons and basically made the argument that if you run barefoot and you never drink Gatorade, and you'll never have any problems, right? It's the naturalistic fallacy, right? That
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Whereas as an evolutionary biologist, I think that everything has trade-offs. There are costs and benefits to everything. Shoes are no exception. There are benefits to wearing shoes, and there are costs to wearing shoes. And it depends on who you are, what you're doing. If you're running 20 miles a week and you're not running that fast, it's probably fine for you to land on your heel in a cushioned shoe. But if you're seriously injured from impact peaks, then maybe you should think about switching. But it's not. There's no simple prescription. But the way everything gets you know the way science is often communicated to the public is kind of this all or nothing, pro or con kind of perspective. And I think it really does an enormous disservice. I can give you dozens and dozens of
Sure.
examples of how this happens all the time.
Well, you've gone from a topic that you said hardly anyone was interested in now to a topic that virtually everyone is interested in, it seems.
Yeah, that was kind of weird. um, and um, 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 but I had a kind of midlife crisis when all this was going on, right? I mean, I was, I've been working for years and years on this book on the evolution of the human head. It took me like, I can't tell you how long I spent working on that book. And then while I was working on that book, all the barefoot running and the head, running stuff came out. And I realized that, um, what I really wanted to do with the remainder of my career was focus on how evolutionary theory and data are really important for health, and physical activity is really what I can focus on. It's what I know a lot about. And in a way, if we can just, what I really care about is trying to help people become more physically active, right? And
Yeah.
how and why exercise and physical activity. I also care about diet too, but how this can help people improve their lives. So if I can take advantage of the interest in this to help educate people and to promote uh, a better understanding of exercise and physical activity and aging and how and why it's important, that that's all to the good. So that's what I care about.
Yeah, yeah. Well, is there more to study about the foot and running? I mean, or is that are you going to keep going that way, or is your research sort of shifting a little bit? I mean, or have you
Well, we're
tell me?
still doing some work in my lab on the foot and running, but we're also looking at walking. I mean, actually, one of the bizarre things
Oh,
about
interesting.
about the papers, I thought when we published the barefoot running stuff, I thought people would start getting interested in barefoot walking because,
Yeah,
most of the time, I bet you and I walk most of the time. I mean, I
yeah,
do like to run, but most of the time I walk, and when I go out the door, almost everybody I see is walking. Walking is pretty darn important, right?
yeah.
And for some bizarre reason, everybody just got super excited about barefoot running and nobody gave a hoot about barefoot walking. And I just got so puzzled by that. So we actually started doing some research on barefoot walking, which we also published in Nature a few years ago.
Uh-huh.
But but I'm really more interested in, I mean, I don't really give a hoot anymore about, whether anybody forefoot strikes or rearfoot strikes. It's up to
Yeah,
them.
yeah, yeah.
But we've published our work on that. They can decide what they want to do. But we are interested in things like flat feet. So we're studying how shoes affect foot strength and how that affects your feet. We're also interested in some of the other components of the foot. So we've done a lot of work on the longitudinal arch of the foot, this arch you see from the side. But
Mm,
there's also a transverse arch that's underneath your metatarsals. It's this curvature that goes from side to side. And it turns out that transverse arch is really important in
mm,
terms of stiffening the foot when you both walk and run.
mm,
And it evolutionarily precedes the longitudinal. Early hominids like Lucy were able to walk just fine without having a proper arch in
mm,
their foot.
mm,
So we've been working on that and working on some new methods to test that. But in my lab, really, we look at really the evolution of physical activity in all its many different ways. We look at effects of exercise on reproduction. We're looking at it on metabolism. We're looking at it at how it affects back pain and back strength and aging and I'm interested in. So that's really kind of our
mm,
larger
mm,
kind of
mm, mm.
larger interests. In running is just a part of that.
Well, what are the few things you have to say about exercise? I'm sure everyone always asks you what's the perfect exercise or something like that. But what is your what can you say about exercise and the importance of it that I should know?
Oh yeah, yeah. So first is we never evolved to exercise. So exercise I define as voluntary, discretionary physical activity for the sake of health and fitness.
Hmm.
And until recently, our ancestors had to be very physically active, but were also really um, struggled to get enough food. So, like this morning, I went for a 5 mile run, which is kind of my typical. I'm not really thinking about it kind of distance, right? So I spent about 500 calories. Now, if I were a hunter-gatherer struggling to get enough food, that would have been a really stupid thing to do, to go for a 5 mile run in the morning, waste 500 calories, which I could spend on, feeding my family and investing in my, in things that really matter, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of pointless, needless exercise that we do today is not anything we evolved to do, and yet we shame and blame people for feeling that they that they don't like to exercise.
Yeah, right.
But we didn't. It's a bizarre thing, right? So we evolved to be physically active for two reasons and two reasons only: when it's necessary or somehow rewarding. And today we live in a world where it's neither necessary nor always rewarding. I mean, think about how
Very
unpleasant it is
true.
to run on a treadmill in a gym, right, under the fluorescent lights with all these sweaty, smelly people around, etc. Right? I mean, it's not fun at all, right? You have to watch a video or listen to a podcast like yours to tolerate it, right? And then we make people feel bad because they don't like to do it, right?
Yeah,
But
right.
they're normal, right? And so we need to. So I think that's the most important lesson to learn about exercise. But I think the second most important lesson to learn um, is that it's more important, not less important, as we age, right? Because the reason exercise or physical activity really is healthy is that it's stressful. It stresses the body. Every time you go out for a walk or a run or swim or whatever, climb a mountain, you're generating all kinds of damage to your body. Your mitochondria are spewing out little reactive molecules called reactive oxygen species that cause mutations and to destroy proteins in your body, and your muscles are getting tears and your bones are getting cracks, and you're heating up your body, which is causing other kinds of damage. I mean, every system of your body is stressed by physical activity.
Hmm.
And because it's normal, right? Because we evolved to do that, we evolved all kinds of mechanisms to repair all those different forms of damage.
Hmm.
And we also evolved not just to like barely repair them, we evolved to kind of overshoot, right? To you don't want to. So the analogy I always use is that if I spill coffee on the floor right now and I clean it up, the floor will be a little bit cleaner after I clean up the coffee because I've cleaned it up more than I've dirtied it, right?
Yeah, right.
And that's what happens with the antioxidants we produce and the enzymes that we produce that repair DNA damage, and the enzymes that repair the length of the telomeres at the end of our chromosomes. I could go on, right? Every single one of those forms of damage has potent forms of repair and maintenance that are turned on by exercise.
Hmm.
And the thing is that since we never evolved not to be physically active, we never evolved to turn on these repair and maintenance mechanisms in the absence
Except for it.
of physical activity. So
Interesting.
it's what we call a mismatch to not be physically active. And so
Hmm.
the result is that if you don't exercise or you don't physically active in some way or other, you age faster, right? Your body breaks down at a faster rate. And you're more
Hmm.
vulnerable to pretty much every disease you can possibly think of,
Hmm.
from
Hmm.
infectious diseases to chronic diseases.
Hmm.
And so we never evolved to not be physically active. And as we get older, physical activity has more, not less of an effect on how well we age.
Hmm.
And so I think we should recognize that if we want to help people be physically active, we have to either make it necessary or rewarding or both, and not make people feel bad for not liking to do it. But B, if you really want to help people age better, there's probably, with the possible exception of diet, there's really nothing that is more important than moving, right? Because it's what turns on your body's anti-aging, anti all kinds of you know damage mechanisms that are critical for maintaining health.
Interesting. Now, when you took that 5 mile run, I assume you did it in a barefoot shoe.
Well, first of all, I don't like the term barefoot shoe. It's an oxymoron, right? So I call minimal shoes. Yeah, but
Okay.
yes, I don't. I mean, as my feet have gotten stronger and I've gotten used to um to um to the minimal shoes, I really just dislike having stuff in my shoe. I don't like an arch support, and I don't like
The
too much of
cushion.
a heel and all that
But
kind of
now,
stuff.
before that guy came to your lecture and told you about minimal shoes, I assume you were running in regular traditional shoes with big, thick heels and stuff like
I
that.
was, yeah. I used to get plantar fasciitis. In
Huh.
fact, I used to get horrible plantar fasciitis. I
Huh.
used to change my running shoes constantly, right? Because what happens is the elasticity of the shoe wears out, and you have to, if you wear a running shoe for more than like 250, 300 miles, you're more vulnerable to plantar fasciitis, which is really awful, right?
Yeah. Right.
Uh, and um, and I had, Achilles problems and all that kind of stuff. And I was spending a fortune on running shoes. And
Huh.
when I started learning about barefoot running and I started wearing minimal shoes and also going barefoot, my feet really got a lot stronger. And
Huh.
of course, my running form changed.
Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
that took a lot of effort, though. I didn't just didn't happen overnight. And that's one of the things that you have to do is you can't just transition from being a shod heel striker to a minimally shod forefoot striker. That takes a lot of work and effort. You have to strengthen your calf muscles and your Achilles tendons and all that. So, but all those problems disappeared. It was
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But it took a lot of work.
Huh. What book are you currently working on now? Are you working on a new book right now?
I am, yeah. I'm actually kind of writing a sort of a sequel to Exercised on the evolution of food and diet.
Huh. Interesting. Can you share much about it, or you're keeping it under wraps?
I think at this point, it's kind of, I think it's this point, it's probably best to not talk about it too much, but I'm having a lot of fun writing it. It's kind of an anti BS book about diet and how and why we evolved to never to diet,
Yeah.
basically.
It sounds like you can speak about that for a whole year after the book comes out.
Oh my God. Part of the problem with this book is that it's a huge topic. And so for a few years, I taught a course called Diet and Exercise with some colleagues, and such a fun course to teach. It was an upper level course. And I realized that although I'm more of an expert on physical activity, I had a lot of questions that I wanted to address and explore myself about diet. And so I kind of said it partly because um, so I could learn myself, but also partly so I could, um, I think there's a need for a book like this.
Is it fair to say the foot and the running thing solved your midlife crisis?
um, I always say to students, because I have the fun of teaching a lot of wonderful students here, that you should prepare for your midlife crisis when you're young, right? Because you're going to have it, right? There's a certain point in your life where you're going to be asking, is this what I should be doing for the remaining years of my life? And I think one of the really privileges of being a professor, especially at a great research university, is that I don't have a boss really. I can do what I want to do, and so I was able to kind of switch to something that I think I find really meaningful and valuable,
Yeah.
which is to
Yeah.
try to help make the world a little bit of a better place. When I was working on things like brow ridges and like, does anybody really care that much about brow ridges? I mean, they're not going to, it's, or that whether Homo habilis is the ancestor of Homo erectus. Nobody really cares about that. But working on how to help people stay healthier and live better lives, that's really meaningful. So yes, I think it's really transformed my life, and it helps keep me going because academia, publishing, I mean, it's sometimes hand-to-hand combat the way scientists deal with each other, and remembering why I'm doing what I'm doing, even if I'm wrong, right? It's still something that I find really, really meaningful and valuable.
Well, Dan, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. When your book does come out, I hope you will come back and tell me more about it.
Sure, I'd be delighted to.
This is Richard Hsu and Dan Lieberman. Thanks.